Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for our AstroTours Earth Hour event. My name is Simran Nerval, and I'm a PhD student here at the University of Toronto in the Department of Astronomy and Astrophysics. I would like to begin today's event with a land acknowledgement. I am tuning in from Toronto, which is situated on the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of Credit River. The territory was subject of the Dish with One Spoon, One Bum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Ojibwe and Allied Nations to peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Acknowledging the traditional territory on which we live and work is a small but important step that reminds us to learn more about the Indigenous peoples in these regions, and to consider the history and ongoing colonialism on this land, to reflect on how each of us can contribute to reconciliation. We're lucky enough today to have people tuning in from across the country. You can visit native-land and whose.land to learn about the land that you're on and who it belongs to. So, as I mentioned earlier, this is our Earth Hour event. Earth Hour is today from 8:30 to 9:30 p.m. It happens every year on the last Saturday of March. And it has supporters from around, it's where supporters from around the world unite and try to take action on raising awareness of the issues facing our home, the Earth. If possible, keep your lights off from the hour of 8:30 to 9:30. And to learn more about Earth Hour, visit earthhour.org. So if this is your first time attending AstroTours, we run our tours generally on the first Thursday of most months. And tonight we have talks by PhD students Laura Saunders, Cameron So, and Stephanie Gagliardi. After the talk, we will be heading over to a Zoom room for a variety of activities and demonstrations, including learning about the greenhouse effect, comparing Earth's atmosphere to Venus's atmosphere, and ask an atmospheric scientist. AstroTours is organized and run by graduate students in the Department of Astronomy and Astrophysics at the University of Toronto, and supported by volunteers who are undergraduate and graduate students in astronomy and physics. We run AstroTours to share our passion, so we really value feedback from our attendees. After this event, please go to bit.ly/astrotours to give us your feedback. And this month, on the feedback form, we'll actually have an option for you to enter your name and email to enter our Earth Hour raffle, where we will be giving out our Earth Hour logo merch. We'll be drawing 4 entries at random to receive prizes. Our first entry will get the tote bag with our logo on it. The second one is a mug. Third is a notebook, and fourth place will be a magnet and a sticker and a pin. And before we get to our event, I'll just quickly go over some upcoming events. Our next AstroTour will be in May. It'll be a talk by Fergus Harobin on planet and star formation on Thursday, May 5th at 8 p.m. EST, and this one will still be online. Also, for events by other organizations, you can visit the Dunlap Institute Facebook page for information on their Cosmos from the Couch video series and the virtual Astro Trivia night on Tuesday, April 5th at 7 p.m. EST. Also, check out the RASC website, or the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada, to see all the events that they'll be holding this month. Now, we'll go on to our first speaker of the night, Laura Saunders. She's a 4th-year PhD candidate in the Department of Physics at the University of Toronto with a collaborative specialization in environmental studies. She completed her undergraduate degree in physics at McGill University in 2017. In her spare time, she loves climbing, skiing, walking her dog, and rewatching Gilmore Girls. Without further ado, I will now pass it off to Laura to tell us about why we can trust climate models.
Thank you, Simran, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm Laura. I'm a PhD student in the Atmospheric Physics group at U of T. And today, as Simran said, I'll talk about why we can trust climate models. So the first question I want to answer is, why do we need climate models in the first place? Why can't we just use our measurements of what's going on in the atmosphere? And the answer is basically just that the Earth is really big and we can't measure everywhere all the time. So we need climate models to give us a best guess of what's going on in the gaps between our measurements. And those gaps could be either in time or in space. So that's one of the main reasons. The other thing is that we only have one Earth. Okay, which is a very small sample size for a scientific study. So if we want to study something like climate change, we can't just allow it to happen and then run back the clock and try again and see what happens. We only get one chance. So what we can do is we can use climate models to give us a guess of what will happen in the future. And we can run those multiple times, and that's how we can get our large sample size for our study. So climate models basically are computer programs that we've input equations and such into, and then they will create a simulation of what the Earth is going to do under certain conditions. Okay, and a question that many people are asking, and it is a legitimate question, is how on earth can you possibly make a climate model that can accurately depict everything that's going on Earth? Because the Earth is a very complex system. As you can see in this image here, there are a lot of different processes going on at all times. And it's true, there's no way we could make a single climate model that includes every single process happening on Earth. It's just, it couldn't happen. And even if it did, there's no computer that would be able to run that. But the nice thing is that we actually don't need a model that can do that. We can make do with something a little bit simpler, which is actually the entire point of having something called a model. So to explain this, I'm going to go back a few steps and just explain what a scientific model actually is. Oh. What just happened? This isn't... Okay, perfect, thanks. Okay, so a model is basically just a simplification or a representation of a physical phenomenon. So one example here that's really simple is just the drawing I have on this slide. So this is supposed to depict a person standing on the surface of the Earth. This isn't accurate at all. This isn't what people really look like. The Earth is not just a blue circle, and neither of these two things are two-dimensional. Also, people are a lot smaller compared to the Earth than I've shown in this drawing, but the drawing gets across the point that I want it to. So it's a good enough model for this situation. The other model I want to talk about as an example is one that people learn in their very first physics course, either in high school or university, and that is the equation that tells you what the force of gravity is that's pulling you or an object toward the Earth if you have a mass m. And that force is just equal to the mass times a constant g, which is 9.8 newtons per kilogram. And this is a very common equation. It works everywhere on the surface of the Earth, and it's used by scientists every single day. But if you leave the surface of the Earth and go to outer space, F equals mg isn't true anymore. And does that mean that it's not a useful model? Not at all. It's extremely useful on the surface of the Earth, which is where a lot of stuff we care about happens. It just means that we need to be careful about where and when we use it. And that's exactly what we do with climate models. We don't just have one model that we're relying on. We have many different models that... Sorry, I'm having trouble changing slides here. Okay, we have a lot of different climate models, and we're careful about where and when we use them. They each have their strengths and weaknesses in certain situations. So a few differences that you can have between models are the scope. So some models look at or give a guess or simulation of what happens all over the world. Those are global climate models. Some of them are regional, and they maybe look at one continent, or some are really, really local and maybe even look at just one city or one really small portion of a neighborhood. So it just depends on what you're looking at. Some other things that can be different between them are the chemical reactions that are included, what types of emissions you include, all sorts of things, how the air is transported. And the idea is that you can ask these different models, okay, what would happen if, say, we doubled our CO2 emissions, or if we halved them, and then you can run them into the future and see what they predict. And if you do that a lot of times with many different models, you can start to get an idea of what the trend is. And that's exactly what we're trying to do with models. So as I said, part of this is knowing where these models are accurate and reliable. And the way that we determine that is by comparing these models and what they simulate with measurements. So models don't just go into the future, they also show what's happening in the past up to the present. So we can compare the past and present output from the models with measurements. And I've got an example to sort of illustrate what this looks like. Okay, so sort of an analogy that I like to tell people is if you look at the time on your microwave and you notice that it's 5 minutes ahead of what's on your cell phone, which you know is more accurate, You don't just say, okay, the clock on my microwave is useless and I'm never using it again. You have two options. You can either turn the clock on your microwave back 5 minutes so it matches your cell phone, or you can just leave it and be aware that it's 5 minutes fast. Both of these are valid options and make the clock useful again. So there are sort of equivalent strategies that we can do like this with climate models. So the first thing would be if you notice that, say, your climate model produces too much CO2 during the summer or something, you can go back to the program and change a few things and run it again to see if that fixes the problem and doesn't create another problem in the process. But that's not really an option with a lot of climate models because a lot of them are very complex and and it takes a long time to run them. And so it's not an option to fix something, every time you find an inaccuracy. But what you can do instead is just continue using the model, but keep track of the biases and inaccuracies that you find when you compare them with measurements. So you know the limitations of the model. And that's where my research comes in. So what I do is I'm a very small cog in a huge machine that so I evaluate output from two global climate models that are both from Environment and Climate Change Canada. And I do that by comparing the concentrations that they output for various different gases in the atmosphere. I compare what the models say with what a satellite instrument actually measures. And that satellite instrument is the Atmospheric Chemistry Experiment Fourier Transform Spectrometer, or ACE-FTS, which is a very cool satellite that I don't have much time to talk or any time to talk about today. But it's a really neat instrument. And the models that I'm evaluating are the Canadian Middle Atmosphere model and the Global Environmental Multiscale Modeling Air Quality and Chemistry model, or GEMMOC. So that one's a little bit newer. It's kind of in its infancy, or it used to be a forecasting model, but now it's sort of being extended higher up into the atmosphere. And so they want to know how good is our first, try at simulating higher up into the atmosphere. So I'm comparing with measurements and working with them to see how well it works. So I do this by comparing the concentrations of multiple gases, but today I wanted to focus on just one of them, which is ozone, because it is an example of a very successful endeavor, I guess, in climate science, which we don't hear about a lot because sometimes, climate science isn't used the way we want it to be. So you may recall in the past decade or two, ozone has been in the news a lot because the ozone layer has a hole in it. So we want the ozone layer to be to not have a hole in it because ozone protects us from a lot of UV radiation. And if we didn't have it, there would be a health crisis and much more skin cancer than there currently is. But there is a hole in the ozone layer that forms over Antarctica during the southern hemispheric spring. And I just want to go over the story of sort of how we discovered this and then started to fix it, because it's a good illustration of how climate models are helpful. So before the 1970s, we would use different chlorine gases for various industrial purposes, including refrigeration and air conditioning. The most well-known of these chlorine gases are the CFCs, so CFC-11 and CFC-12. And we thought that when you emitted them into the atmosphere that they were harmless. And that's mostly true because if you emit them into the troposphere, which is the lowest layer of the atmosphere, they don't interact with any other gases. They just float around and don't do anything. So they are actually harmless in the troposphere. But the problem is if something lasts a long time in the troposphere, it eventually gets brought up into the stratosphere, which is the second lowest layer. And at that point, sunlight can actually break apart those gases and turn them into other chlorine gases. And then those are able to destroy ozone really, really quickly. And so once this was discovered in 1974, like 10 years of really, really rapid research followed. And it was determined that if we allowed this to continue, we would have a huge problem on our hands and a large ozone hole and a health crisis. And so this led to the 1987 Montreal Protocol, which was a mandatory international plan to eliminate chlorine and bromine source gas emissions by 2040. And it was very successful. By the mid-1990s, the concentrations of these gases in the atmosphere were decreasing. And since the early 2000s, we have seen ozone start to recover. So this Yeah, the Montreal Protocol is one of the most successful international treaties to date. So climate scientists discovered a problem and then policymakers did something about it, which maybe doesn't sound too familiar. Okay, and climate models are useful because while ozone has started to recover, it's not quite back to where it was. So climate models can help us predict when it's going to get to that point. So I've shown the predictions from various models in this this figure. This is not something that I made. This is from a colleague from 2018. So the y-axis is just the amount of ozone, and the x-axis is the year. So it goes from about 1960 to 2100. So the present day is right about where this black line with the triangles ends. And each line is the guess from one climate model. So they're all different models that are simulating what ozone is going to do. And so you can see all of them agree on the general shape that ozone decreases until about 2000 and then starts to increase again. And so if you ask, when is ozone going to get back to what it was in 1980, there's a range of dates that they guess. Some say 2039, and then some say as late as 2050, which is a fairly large range. But they all agree on the trend that ozone is recovering. And that's basically all you need to know for policy. We know that we did what was required and ozone is on its way back up. So that's great. Now, the question is, when we look at something similar for how carbon dioxide and global warming are going to affect our climate, policymakers aren't as quick to react. But if we look at a similar graph, which shows how a bunch of different models predict the surface temperature of the Earth is going to change. So again, on the y-axis, we have the global average surface temperature in Fahrenheit on the left and in Celsius on the right. And then we have the year on the x-axis here. We can see that they all agree the temperature is going to rise. Now that does depend on how our emissions change from here on out. So the green lines are all models that have been told we're going to decrease our emissions, become eco superstars, and everything's going to be great. And the red lines are from models that were told our emissions are going to increase. And then the yellow and orange are somewhere in between. And while they don't agree on how much the surface is going to warm, and part of that is due to the emissions difference, they do all agree that it is going to warm up. And that's the main thing we need to know. If you look at a similar graph with precipitation and how that's going to change, all of these models agree precipitation is going to increase. That's going to create more drastic weather events. Similar story with forest fires. They're going to become more frequent. We've already seen that they're becoming more frequent. So for a lot of this stuff, we don't even need the models to tell us. We're already seeing it in real time. So if the models all agree that this climate change is going to be a problem, why is it that policymakers aren't doing anything about it, or at least not enough about it, like they did with CFCs and ozone depletion? So there are a few reasons. One of them is that we were not nearly as reliant on chlorine gases for industry as we are now on fossil fuels, which are the main source of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that's produced by humans. So it's true, it's a difficult problem to solve. It doesn't change the fact that we need to solve it. And so it is inconvenient. There's a reason that documentary from Al Gore is called An Inconvenient Truth. It's going to be really difficult to change. The other thing is that there's not much motivation for a lot of politicians to do anything, because while the ozone hole could have caused harm in the really short term, climate change is very long term and slow. It's more of a frog in boiling water kind of situation. For example, I know now the summers are really, really hot compared to what they were like when I was a kid, but I don't notice the change from year to year. And I think that's true of a lot of people. Like, you can't see from year to year the difference. You have to really think about what it was like 10, 15, 20 years ago or longer. And also climate change affects lower income people and developing nations more aggressively. And so if you're a wealthy politician in North America who has an election coming up in 2 to 4 years, it's not going to be at the top of your priority list to do something about climate change if all you're concerned about is getting reelected or are concerned about things that affect you personally. And Ronald Reagan's administration was actually a great illustration of this. They actively fought to prevent climate action. There was actually a memo going around the White House saying, let's increase uncertainty about climate change so that the public won't ask us to do anything about it. And it worked. We have so many people and politicians today who don't believe that climate change is a problem. And part of that uncertainty is driven by this idea that, well, the Earth is too complex. You can't possibly model it accurately. But I hope that in the past 15 minutes or so, I've gotten across the point that we don't need a perfect climate model. And we're doing our best to make sure that the ones we have are accurate and reliable and that we know where to use them. So just to summarize what I've said today, we have many different climate models that are useful in different situations, just like equations like F equals mg are great for one situation and not so great for another. And then you just need to know where you can use it. And the other thing is that I'm one of thousands of people who are constantly comparing climate model output with measurements to check for inaccuracies. So when we're using these models to look into the future or try to understand something, we're very much aware of the biases they have, and we're careful to take that into consideration when we draw conclusions from them. And so since all these models have been checked and they're all saying pretty much the same thing, just to a different extent, the question isn't really if climate change is going to happen, it's just how bad is it going to be? And that depends a lot on our actions from here on out. Thank you. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Hi, sorry about that. I was just trying to get to put my video on. Thank you for the really awesome and interesting talk. Yeah, so we can now give Laura questions. Please put them in the YouTube chat. Okay, and I guess while we're waiting for someone to come in, I'll start with one. So you were talking about how like this ozone problem, it was more of a short-term thing because people were able to fix it quite fast, but on fossil fuels, we're a lot more reliant on them, and it's going to be more of a long-term problem. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on like why there's such a big difference between something that's so short-term and like why this fossil fuel issue is going to make it so we have a lot more we have to do to fix the issue because it'll be around for longer.
Okay, so when I said that the ozone issue was short term, I just meant that the ozone hole was like a more immediate danger. And so like the UV rays were going to start coming in within a few years. And so there was more urgency to solve it. And I think if that were the case with climate change, perhaps there would be a similar urgency, but it's all sort of like, oh yes, we're going to, everything's going to be awful in 2050, and so really the difference is that the issues caused by the ozone hole were on like an election time scale. And so it was something that politicians were motivated to do something about, but the issues caused by climate change are not so much on an election time scale. And also they're much less noticeable. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. And I guess to give people a little bit more context on, what you're doing, you said that you work with the ACE satellite. How is the ACE satellite used to be able to, explore these types of issues?
Okay, so ACE, it's on a satellite called SciSat. ACE is just the instrument that's on it. And it's great because it's on a satellite, it can get global measurements. And the way that it takes measurements allows it to get measurements of over 40 different gases in the atmosphere, which is a lot compared to a lot of different measurements. So you have these global measurements of many different gases. And so it makes it much easier to explore the interactions between the gases because you can find relationships between them. So you can see that, oh, well, when ozone increases, methane decreases. And so this shows that there's a chemical reaction that causes that to happen. And it's great for comparing with climate models, especially global ones, because climate models, just because everything is sort of ideal in a climate model, they are able to simulate or guess the concentrations of lots of different gases. And so if you can compare those concentrations with measurements from the same instrument, you can remove a lot of bias in the comparison. Whereas if you're comparing two gases from a climate model and each one is being compared to a different instrument, you then also have to worry about the differences between those two instruments. So ACE is just really great in that it's global and it has a lot of different gases. So it's really handy for these types of comparisons.
Yeah, That's really cool. And yeah, it's really cool that there's this instrument that can measure all of these things in our actual atmosphere. I guess another question would be, what suggestions do you have for people? Because you were saying how, at least before with the ozone hole, people were able to get politicians to like do something about it. But we're having a bit more issues doing that now. Do you have any suggestions of what people could do?
I wish I did. Yeah, I guess just be aware of your local and federal politicians and what they're doing about climate change. I don't want to make any like political statements right now, but basically what we're doing now isn't enough. And I don't know, before the pandemic, we had these really great rallies with Fridays for Future. So I don't know if that's going to start up again, but if they do, I recommend participating in that kind of thing and keep pressuring your MP, your MPP, especially if you're young, just say like, I'm scared because I have to live on this planet for another 60 plus years and I don't know what's going to happen. Yeah, I mean, I wish I had a better answer, but really we need systemic change. And there are like individual things people can do, but those aren't going to help to the same extent. It's not going to be enough. We need governments to actually do something like they did for ozone.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's really cool. And yeah, it was really interesting to like hear about, you're talking about all these different models that you're comparing with and how we have these instruments that we can look at. Yeah, it was really, really interesting and a really informative talk. Thank you so much, Laura.
Thanks, Simran.
Great. So now we'll go on to our second speaker of the night, which is Cameron So. Cameron is a PhD student in the Department of Biology at McGill University. He previously completed his master's in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Toronto, studying the capacity for adaptation to climate warming in the annual field mustard. His current research focuses on conserving plants at risk in Canada. Outside of school, he enjoys hiking, frisbee, and attempting to grow heirloom tomatoes. I will now pass it off to Cameron to tell us about plant adaptation to climate change.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Simran, for that introduction. And that was a great talk by Laura. I love learning about models. It always informs me of doing my own experiments, which I will talk about today. So my name is Cameron. I am a PhD student in the Department of Biology at McGill University. But today I'm really going to talk about the research I did as a master's student back when I was at the University of Toronto in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. So as we know, the climate is warming at an extreme rate, and this is due to anthropogenic climate change. Warming poses a challenge to biodiversity. Species might be adapted to current temperatures, but not to novel warming. And so ultimately, warming could lead to population decline, extinction, and thus the loss of biodiversity. And so today I'm going to talk about how plants in particular are responding to climate change and how wild plants could continue to persist under these novel environmental changes. And so when we think about plant persistence under climate change, there are really three strategies by which plants could continue to persist and survive and reproduce. And the first one is migration. So when we think about migration, it's just simply plants moving to more favorable conditions. And there have been a lot of observations by scientists that plants are moving to higher in latitude, so northwards towards the poles or southwards towards the South Pole, or higher up a mountain slope, so higher in elevation. So they're essentially tracking the climate that best matches their physiological limits. And these plants could be moving not by themselves, but of course the seeds that are produced by the plants, so the kids or the progeny, because plants can't move like how animals do. They don't really have legs. The second strategy is plasticity. So plasticity just refers to plants or individuals just changing a trait in response to some environmental change. So if it gets really hot, plants might produce more leaves to get really big and soak in more sun. Some plants might change the timing of their phenology, so like when they emerge from the soil, when they start producing flowers. And so there's a lot of suite of traits that plants can kind of change in response to these changing environments. But plasticity is really depends on the genetic makeup of whatever plant we're talking about. And so it's really constrained to that genetic makeup or within the genes that individual might have. And so the final strategy is something called adaptive evolution. And essentially, this is, instead of referring to individuals like plasticity, it's referring to populations, where populations are evolving new traits, similar traits to plasticity, but how it arises is through natural selection. So if a trait confers some type of advantage and it's really in low frequency, so not a lot of individuals have that trait in that population, but it's good under climate change, then we would expect it to be more dominant through that population. And what's important to note here is that adaptive evolution is really important for the long-term persistence of any wild plant population, because plasticity just might not be extending to those bounds to which climate is warming. And so I'm just going to talk about 3 examples for each of these strategies. The first one being migration. And so these researchers, Kelly and Golden, basically observed plants moving or migrating upslope in the Santa Rosa Mountains in California. So this is just one of many examples across the world. And so what these researchers did is that they just measured the coverage of these 10 different plant species on this mountain slope in 1977. And then they returned back to this mountain slope in 2007, 30 years later. And they found that these 10 dominant species are migrating about 65 meters upwards in elevation, and they attribute this to climate warming. And so this is one way of which plants are persisting to climate warming, but you can kind of think that there's also limitations to migration. There's a peak to a mountain, and there's also things like the cane shield in Canada. So when plants are migrating northwards, there's bounds to which are limits to which plants can continue to migrate and track climate. And that's also not to say that plants might not even migrate at the same pace that climate is warming. And then so the second example we have here is for plasticity. And so we have this plant here called the Drummond's rockcress, which is a plant that grows in the US Rocky Mountains in Colorado State. And what these researchers did, Anderson and her colleagues, is that they measured these plants and when they begin to flower throughout the year. So this data set was actually comprised by this person who lived in the mountains for many, many years, and they just collect that data set for that person. So, so what they found is that these plants are flowering earlier on the year over the years. So I have this graph here, and if you look at the x-axis, it just looks at the time, so the length of their data set from 1975, 2010. And then when they looked at when the flowers begin to, once the plants begin to flower, they were just flowering early in the year. So you see that negative correlation where plants are flowering over the years towards the bottom of that graph, so towards June 1st. And the reason for these plants flowering earlier is simply because the snowpack in these mountains is smaller and smaller. So there's less precipitation, there's less snow happening. And so because there's less snowpack, the snow is melting earlier in the year when spring arrives. And so the plants can track this, this early snowpack melt and then start acquiring resources earlier and then also start flowering earlier. And so this is just an example of plasticity where individuals are able to just look at the environmental change and respond to it and change their traits and and take advantage of this climate warming. And then finally, we have an example for adaptive evolution. So here we have this plant called wild mustard, which is found all throughout North America. And what these researchers found is that this plant was evolving an earlier flowering time in response to a multi-year drought. And so what they did is they essentially collected seeds before a multi-year drought in 1997. And then they collected seeds again of the same populations post-drought in 2004. And so they grew these individuals or these seeds in both wet and dry environments. First starting with the the yellow circled bars, which is just the 1990 seeds, the pre-drought seeds. And then they compare them to the same seeds that were collected, or sorry, the seeds that were collected post-drought. So the ones that are circled in red. And what they found is that plants were flowering earlier in the year. And this is to avoid drought. So if you flower earlier in the year before the drought happens, then you can survive, you can produce your seed and start a new generation in your population. And so this was advantageous here when you're flowering earlier. Okay, so I essentially was interested in similar questions for my master's thesis when I was back at the University of Toronto. And I did most of my work with Professor Arthur Weiss. And I really want to understand, well, climate is going to continue to warm. We know that it responded to previous warming, but it's going to warm potentially 4 degrees more, kind of what Lauren talked about, all these different climate models. That's just what's expected. So can plants continue to persist? Can they adapt, or do they have the genes to plastically respond? And so I had 2 central questions for my master's thesis, which is, can plants respond plastically to climate warming? Do they have the genes that allows them to do well, or can maintain their survival and reproduction? Or can these plants evolve to climate warming? Do they have the adaptive potential to do so? And so when I refer to adaptive potential or adaptive evolution, I'm referring to the genetic variation of a population. So genetic variation is essential for evolution. And so let's just say, if an example here, we're talking about genetic variation for a particular trait, which in this case is height. So all these different plants in a population have different heights. And if this trait, which is height, is heritable, so when I mean heritable, it can be passed on from the parents onto the kids or the progeny to the next generation, then we would expect that there is genetic variation for this trait because there's different heights. There's different heights that are expressed in this population. But let's say all these plants in the population have similar heights. The trait's still heritable, it can be passed on, but there's not a lot of variation. There's no differences between the plants in their phenotypes. And so we would expect, in their traits. So we would expect that there's no genetic variation for this trait, which is height. And obviously we're interested in how plants persist. So my question was, what's the genetic variation for reproduction? How well can they evolve the ability to produce a lot of seeds under this new thermal regime, this new climate warming? And so I did most of my work, or all my work, with a wild mustard, which is related to your common grocery goods. This is also the same plant in the previous study that I mentioned. And it's related to a lot of common grocery goods like bok choy and broccoli. So if you ever see your bok choy, your broccoli flower, because you've held on it for too long, it will also produce the same characteristic yellow flowers. And so we collected, or previously people in my lab collected these plants from Quebec. And I did a lot of my work at the Koffler Scientific Reserve at Jokers Hill, which is about 1 hour north of Toronto, in King City or Newmarket. It borders those 2 cities. And this is a huge acre of land that's owned by the University of Toronto. And actually, you have the opportunity to visit this place if you ever want to. It's open to the public. There's public trails. Of course, there's research lands, which are protected and they're off limits because you want to trample on someone's plant that they're observing. But if you go to these public trails, I really encourage everyone to go there sometime in the spring, because there's like blankets of trillium, which is a provincial flower of Ontario. So if you want to check those plants out, I would encourage you to come out in the spring. It's beautiful. And they're only there for a short time, so check it out. And so I did a lot of my work, my experiments, with the experimental climbing worm array, which is just shown in this image here in the middle, but I'll talk about it a little later. But what we did is we glued on seeds to so it's 7,000 of these seeds, so lots of them, took a lot of time. And then we glued them on these popsicle sticks, and then we planted them in the ground before the ground froze over. So on the right side, just here, you can see all those popsicle sticks with the seeds in them. And then each of those popsicle sticks have numbers, so we could track which individual is which, and then each seed of those on the popsicle stick is a genetically distinct individual. And so I want to thank all the undergrads who bear the cold and help me plant those seeds in the ground. And so we experimentally warmed our plots by 4 degrees Celsius, thrusting these plants about 80 years into the future. But before we could turn on the heaters, so how the heaters work is they just use infrared, which is heat up some plot of land. But before we turn them on, we use these open top chambers or these mini greenhouses because we couldn't turn on the heaters at the time. The sensors just didn't detect temperatures at the time, so we use open top chambers to simulate warming in the spring to help the snow melt earlier and so on. And so it's a unique apparatus that's only found in like 3 other parts in North America. It's really unique to Toronto and the research program here at the University of Toronto. And so when the heating started going on and the plants started germinating, we measured a lot of different traits in the spring and throughout the summer. So when I talk about traits like phenology, I'm just talking about the timing to germinate, the timing to start producing flower, how big the plants got, how many leaves they produced, how high they grew, the stem diameter, and of course their survival and reproduction. So how many seeds or seed pods that they produce. And we're talking seed pods, just like the fruits of the plants. And so our predictions was that under heated conditions, we expected plants to respond negatively. Like it's hot, and I sat underneath those heaters sometimes, and I'm like sweating. So I would expect these plants to do pretty poorly as well. But we would also expect greater genetic variation. So if you have greater genetic variation, then you would expect higher adaptive potential, which means it would be able to evolve through natural selection to warming. But what we found was quite different. These plants were flowering earlier. They were producing more leaves. They were getting bigger. They were having bigger stems, and they were also increasing their reproductive output. So increasing the number of seeds that were producing and the seed pods that they were producing, the fruits. And so this was quite unexpected. They seem to be pre-adapted to warming. And I think this is the case because these plants come from the Mediterranean and the Middle East. So wild mustard is actually not from North America. It was introduced from Europe, potentially by some farmers or whatnot, for some crop fields, but it's not from North America. And so it could be potentially pre-adapted because it was previously exposed to warmer environments like in the Middle East. And so they carried on those genes all the way through generations and generations and generations, and it was able to respond and do well under warming. That's what we think. But importantly, genetic variation under these heated conditions was quite low. So you need high genetic variation for adaptive potential, but we didn't see that. So ultimately, there was a low adaptive potential for this population. And so what does this mean for the future of the species? Well, that means that, under projected warming, these plants could continue to persist through plasticity. It's able to change its traits, produce more seed with its current genetics. But let's say there's continuous warming, maybe it could not adapt and survive, persist through adaptive evolution. So adaptive evolution is important for long-term persistence. And we didn't consider things like extreme weather. So there could be things like heat waves that could really just be detrimental at one single point in these plants' lives. So it seems like they could survive, but it's not really. There could be like very more extreme events that could cause these plants to die off. And so I just want to end my talk here by saying that I'm currently a PhD student at McGill University. I'm switching my study system. I'm actually interested in studying this beautiful lupin, which is found in oak savanna habitat. It's an at-risk species, and it's associated with 3 endangered butterflies which all three of which are actually extirpated, so locally extinct in Canada. So it's only found in the States, and they're thinking of reintroducing those butterflies into Canada. But this plant, you can find it in remnants of these oak savanna habitats. But 90% of these oak savanna habitats are gone in and throughout North America. But you can actually visit a remnant of this oak savanna habitat in High Park. So if you head to High Park, just a little west of the University of Toronto downtown, you can visit these remnants of these last remaining ecosystems and habitats. And you might even find this plant, but if you do, please don't step in it, because literally they're going locally extinct as well in Ontario. So we want to protect it. But yeah, I'm very interested and excited to work with this plant. So just a little sneak peek. And then finally, I want to thank everyone who helped me out with my research. And if biodiversity matters to you, there's a lot of things that you can do to protect these species that are at risk of extinction. And I'll just leave these up. So I want to thank everyone for listening to me talk, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Cameron, for the super interesting talk. I'll leave it here so that people can see it a little bit longer instead of going to the slide that just says questions. One thing before we get into the questions that I just want to say is, like, you really blew my mind when you explained that mustard is related to broccoli and bok choy. I never would have thought that before.
Yeah.
That's super interesting. Yeah, so that was a really cool piece of information.
For sure. There's a lot of like grocery goods, like kale, for example, is also in the same family of plants. Like everything that you eat is like actually related to each other, and it was just created from domestication. So it's hard to know it, but if one day when these plants are flowering, like because they're just getting a little old at the grocery store, it's cool to be like, oh wait, I've seen that flower before. Like I've seen that yellow flower before. Like it's on my kale and my broccoli. Like interesting. It must be related.
Yeah, that's really cool, and a really cool thing to like look for too. Yeah, for example, as you said, like when you have your own groceries. So now onto some questions. This one's a two-part question. Why is genetic variation so essential for evolution? And on that, how do you keep a high genetic variation if our natural selection or evolution is favoring traits?
Oh, that's a very in-depth answer. I confirm that, but really shortly. So why is genetic variation important? So let's say back to the example where I talked about the genetic variation for height. If you only have a few individuals, like you have a huge population of plants, but only small of them show this variation. So like a small few of these plants are really tall, and being really tall confers some type of advantage in this population. So I know you're really tall, so you're able to outshade everyone else and get more sun, get really big, and produce seeds faster. If that trait is heritable, which means it can pass on to your kids, then it could be advantageous and pass on to next generation. We would see more taller plants over time. But if there is no genetic variation, which means that like maybe there's no plants that are tall at all, maybe they're all short, then where could it go? It's just out of opportunities to evolve and be advantageous. Maybe all these plants that are short just simply die off because like some insect is coming by and just eating everything up. Then that's bad, right? So when we have a diverse amount of people or like plants in a population that have different ways of how they survive, then if there's an environmental change like climate warming, then some plants might survive, or some of these plants might survive. And if they do survive, then they'll pass on their genes to the next generation, and that's how they persist. That's how also we get like speciation and biodiversity. And to answer your second question, how do we like maintain genetic variation? That's like a very long-standing question in evolution. But like there's many ways that we can think about restoring genetic variation. And that one way that I'm personally interested in is something called like assisted gene flow, or simply like when you take one population and say like, okay, this one's really depleted of genetic variation. So let's take another population from like down south in the United States or something, and let's have them cross or like switch genes or share genes with each other. And that's like one way for which genetic variation can be increased.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah. And like a way that people can actually like help plants by moving plants from one location to another.
I'll be a little cautious. I wouldn't recommend that because obviously there's like international laws. So like, you know, the States doesn't like you bringing in seed material or like live material from their places. But yeah, for sure. That's one way that conservation is thinking of it as to save wild species. Yeah.
Yeah. And sorry, no, I was not suggesting that people go do this. Like scientists that know which ones to bring to make it helpful.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, just because sometimes you hear about people bringing things and it's like invasive. So I'm just saying this is interesting to hear about like another way it can be used, but for good. Yeah. So one thing that you mentioned was that these mustard plants are originally from like really warm climates, right? The Mediterranean, Middle East. And that might be why they're doing so well here. What do you think will happen to more like, I guess, local plants aren't used to like this heating temperature? Like, how do you think that they would respond to an experiment like this?
Yeah, I mean, that's literally why we're worried about extinction and loss of biodiversity. Some plants just don't have the ability to respond so well. I mean, mustard is an annual plant. What I mean annual plant is that it reproduces every year. But some plants, like trees, just take so long to grow and reproduce. And within that time scale, they could go extinct because they just don't, it hasn't been 10 years or so where they could start producing seed. And so a lot of plants could be potentially at risk. And there's a lot of plants that are also what we call specialists. So they only live in specific environments, like in the prairies, or they only live on like sandy dunes. And so if there's no sandy dunes northwards, like there's a giant lake in the way, how can it migrate northwards, or how can it like move to a more favorable habitat? And so it really can't. And we're going to lose a lot of species potentially by climate warming.
Yeah, that's very unfortunate.
Yeah.
But yeah, that makes sense given what you've outlined here. What are the traits that you would expect these plants to need and like to be beneficial to them to start surviving in warmer climates? Like, for example, you're talking about like if they're taller or shorter. So for a warmer climate, like what general traits are more useful for plants?
Yeah, for sure. That's a good question. And sometimes we just don't know. I mean, that's a very hard question to ask because you really need to know the ecology and like the background of each plant. But there's just so many plants out there. Like, how do we know, like for a cactus, like or for like a palm tree, how do we know which plant trait is good? And the answer is like sometimes we really just don't. Like, and that's why we look at reproductive success itself. Because when we think about reproduction, it really encompasses all the traits. Things like how well it can survive before it reproduces, how many leaves it can produce before, or the optimal number of leaves it can produce before it reproduces. So we consider reproduction, or what we consider and talk about in evolution biology, as fitness. So how well plants can just survive and reproduce, because it can encompass, as I said, all those traits that might be important.
Interesting. And then our question that we'll wrap up on is, where can we find local conservation projects?
Yeah, there's a lot of conservation projects. So I mean, I talked about plants today, but there's a lot of species that are in need of conservation and protection. And if you're interested in plants particularly, you can look at like the Nature Conservancy of Canada. They have a lot of ongoing protection plans that spans the entire country. There's a lot of like locally done conservation projects, like by Hyde Park. So Hyde Park Nature, which is managed by the city of Toronto. That's if you're interested in plants. So you can just reach out to a lot of local agencies, and they're probably doing their own small projects as themselves. There's also things like Ontario Streams, which is an organization that tries to manage fish species in like river habitat throughout Richmond Hill and Ontario. So they're interested in conserving like Atlantic salmon, or reintroducing Atlantic salmon into the Great Lakes. and as well as protecting other type of small little fishes and invertebrates. So I would say like there's a lot of different conservation agencies out there and goals agencies out there. And I think if you just type in like the type of species that you're interested and plants, fish, whatever, and then the region, you could probably find something. In Toronto, though, I do want to mention, sorry, just to wrap things up, there is something called the TRCA, so the Toronto Region Conservation Authority, and they've really looked after like the majority of the conservation that happens throughout Toronto, and they work with the city of Toronto. And so you can look on their website for projects they're doing, and they're always looking for volunteers to help out, stamp out like invasive species or like monitor different fishes and so like that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's a lot of tips of how to find things. Thank you for the detail.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah, and thank you for the talk. This was super interesting. We'll now go on to our final speaker of the night, which is Stephanie Gagliardi. She is a PhD candidate in the Department of Physical and Environmental Sciences at the University of Toronto. And she's actually going to be defending her PhD very soon, which is super exciting. Congratulations. Her research explores the dynamic links between ecosystem processes and the multi-species plant traits in biodiverse agricultural systems. Her overall research goal is to help inform sustainable farm design and management practices. Outside of work, she enjoys exploring the arts, visiting art galleries and museums, and taking drawing and ballet classes. So I would now like to pass it off to Stephanie, and she can tell us about how agroforestry can help save your morning cup of coffee.
Thank you, Simran. Yeah, so hi everybody, my name is Steph Gagliardi, and today I'm going to be talking a lot about coffee. And the reason why I'm talking about coffee is because, there we go, coffee is one of the world's most popular beverages. So there's around the world, people drink about 2 billion cups of coffee every day. And that adds up to almost 10 billion kilograms of coffee every year. So it's a very popular drink. There we go. So coffee is grown within certain latitudes, and that's you can see that with the green strip on the map there along the tropical regions. And it's commonly called the coffee bean belt. And this is because the climate within this region is generally most suitable for coffee plant growth. And most of the coffee that you drink is grown by smallholder farmers. And smallholder refers to the small size of the farms. So definitions vary, but it's generally less than 10 hectares in area. So they're small farms. And we know that 20 to 25 million families around the world grow coffee for their livelihood, so for their family income. And that's an estimated 100 million people around the world, depending on coffee production. And so today I'm going to be talking about the coffee plant itself. And so many of us here have likely never seen a coffee plant before. So it's pictured here on the far right. And it's a perennial shrub. And that means that it grows continuously, so you don't need to replant it from seed every year. In fact, the coffee plant can actually live up to 100 years, but most farmers would replant it after 20 years just to make sure that it's still producing a good amount of beans. And so the way the coffee plant works is it produces these pretty white flowers, and then those flowers are then pollinated and turn into these beans. And within those beans is what gets roasted and eventually ends up in your morning cup of coffee. And the coffee plant is really special, I think, because it likes to grow in the sun and also in the shade. So oftentimes people think that all plants need lots and lots of sun to grow. And when coffee is grown in these conditions, it's often called full sun monoculture. Monoculture means that there's only one type of plant being grown, so it's only coffee being grown in the fields. And then full sun is referring to how the coffee is exposed to the full sun. But actually, coffee doesn't need that much sun to grow and be healthy. Instead, coffee can be grown in what's called shaded agroforestry. Agroforestry means the integration of trees among the coffee plants. And shaded is referring to how the coffee is protected from the sun, it's shaded, it's growing underneath the canopy of the taller trees. And the reason why coffee can grow in both full sun and shaded agroforestry is because coffee actually evolved in the understory of forests. So it has special adaptations specific to growing in the shade. But at the same time, as we've been breeding coffee over the years, we've been domesticating the plant, we've developed new varieties that can also grow well in these full sun conditions. So coffee can grow almost across a spectrum of different conditions. And so what we're all talking about today, climate change, we know it's going to impact many different aspects of our lives, and it will also impact the world's agriculture. So we will see increasing temperatures, more frequent and intense storms. There's also going to be changing rainfall patterns, which can increase the frequency and intensity of soil drought. And all of these things can impact how plants grow, including the plants that we depend on for our agriculture. So climate change is going to impact specifically coffee in multiple ways, but today I'm just going to focus on 2 ways it's going to be impacted, which is, for one, climate change will impact coffee growing regions, so areas that we can grow coffee. And climate change will also change coffee disease dynamics. So I'm going to start off with the first one, the coffee growing regions. And so I've already mentioned that coffee grows in the specific region, the coffee bean belts. And again, the climate generally is good in those conditions for coffee. But if we were to zoom in on a specific country or a specific region, you're going to see that some regions are better suited to coffee than others, simply because the climate differs as you move across a landscape. So then if you zoom in, right here is a map of Central America. So in the top right corner, sorry, the top left corner, we have part of Mexico. And then the bottom right corner, we have Panama. And every area that is not gray, so every area that's colored and not gray, is where coffee can currently be grown because the climate and the soil conditions are suitable for coffee to grow. However, according to a recent study by D'Souza and colleagues in 2019, they found that with a moderate climate change scenario, so thinking of those models that Laura was talking about earlier, so with a moderate climate change scenario, with an average temperature increase of 1.4 degrees Celsius, there will be a reduction of suitable coffee growing areas in this region in Central America by 55 to 62%. So a reduction in that amount of area by the year 2050. And all of that is highlighted on the map in red. All the areas in red are where we might not see coffee being grown anymore. The areas in dark blue are where, under that scenario, coffee will still be suitable to grow. And then the areas in light blue, which are kind of hard to see, are areas where coffee will become newly suitable. So new areas will open up. And these are mostly in the highlands, mostly in the mountains. But it's only an increase of 9 to 13%. So it doesn't exactly offset the 55 to 62% reduction that we will see. But remember that coffee can grow again in that full sun monoculture and shaded agroforestry. And we can use this adaptability to help reduce the impacts of climate change on coffee. So if we take a look a little bit closer, in the full sun monoculture, again, coffee plants are fully exposed to the high solar radiation, strong winds, higher temperatures. So then with climate change, these coffee plants will still be exposed to that intensifying climate. And that's very different from coffee plants in shaded agroforestry. So under the shade of the larger trees, coffee plants are going to be protected from the high solar radiation. They're protected from the wind. Also, the air temperature under the canopies is moderated, so it doesn't get as hot. So you can think about on a hot summer day, when you're trying to cool off, you might stand under a tree for some shade. You're more comfortable in that shaded area. And that's very similar to the coffee plant. The coffee plant is, more comfortable under the shade of the trees. It's less stressed. It's not in a stressed state when it's in shaded agroforestry. And then again, also with the stronger winds, with the higher solar radiation, hotter sun, it can lead to more drought conditions in the full sun monoculture, meaning that the soil dries out faster. And that's very different from the shaded agroforestry, where the trees can act to improve the soil moisture conditions. So the leaves from the tree, they can be cut or they could fall from the tree naturally, and they can be left to decompose on the soil. And then that actually protects the soil from drying out, so it can hold on to the moisture longer. The tree roots can actually go deeper into the soil profile compared to coffee plant roots. And when they go deeper, they can actually pull up moisture from deeper in the soil profile and bring that moisture up to where the coffee plant roots are and make it available for those coffee plants to access. And then also by increasing the soil moisture content, that will then also impact or increase the humidity under the canopy of the shade trees. So the air isn't as dry. And so then through all these different mechanisms, we can see how planting coffee in shaded agroforestry can help farmers to adapt to the changing climates and also then work to maintain these coffee growing regions. So then for the next part, I'll switch over to looking at some plant diseases. And the one that I focused on for my PhD research is a disease called coffee leaf rust. And it's a major coffee disease. It's found in every coffee producing region of the world. And it's a fungus that attacks coffee leaves. So in the image on the far left, these are signs of early infection, just some yellow spots. Late infection, it's fully covered the leaf. And it doesn't sound that bad, like, oh no, it's going to attack the leaves, but it actually does lead to plant death, which is pictured on the far right. And because it does that, it can significantly impact coffee yield. For example, there was a loss of over $3 billion US from Central and South America between 2008 and 2013 because of a really bad coffee leaf rust epidemic that was going on in that region at that time. And what really sucks is that climate change can actually increase the range of this disease and increase the intensity, so it can impact even more coffee farms. And in full sun monoculture conditions, the main ways that we protect our coffee plants is by using pesticides. So these can be synthetic or organic pesticides, and also breeding new plant varieties that have genetic resistance against the disease. And both of these methods, they can be very effective, but they're also very short term. So we know that coffee leaf rust quickly evolves to evade these protection practices, making them ineffective relatively quickly, that we need to keep redeveloping new pesticides, new plant varieties. So it's almost a losing battle because the fungus evolves so quickly. And instead, in shaded agroforestry systems, we can actually use the complex interactions that are going on to help protect plants against pests and diseases like coffee leaf rust. So we're gonna look a little bit closer at these shaded agroforestry systems and look at the different mechanisms that can take place. There we go. So one way that shaded agroforestry can control pest and disease populations is by creating a physical barrier. So imagine these fungal disease spores floating in the air, they're traveling with the wind. The trees in agroforestry can actually serve as a physical barrier, preventing those fungal spores from going into your coffee agroforestry farm. Also, the trees can act as a trap, so they can actually stick around in the shade tree canopy and almost like get lost in there. So again, they can't move on and infect your coffee plants. I've also mentioned how in shaded agroforestry, the climate changes, so like the temperature is moderated. And these changes to the climate can actually disrupt the disease. Similarly, these climate changes can also change the coffee plant. So I mentioned how the coffee plant would be more comfortable in the shaded agroforestry. That also can mean that it'll be more resilient. It'll be able to withstand stress from a disease better. So it'll be able to survive better. And then lastly, shaded agroforestry increases more than just plant biodiversity. It can also increase the biodiversity of other animals like birds or insects. And some of these other species can actually be antagonists. So they can actually feed on pests or diseases, including coffee leaf rust, and then therefore control their populations and limit the negative impact that they can have on our coffee plants. And so again, overall, shaded agroforestry can help farmers, again, adapt to these changing disease pressures, but more importantly, provide a longer term protection strategy. And then what's also really cool about agroforestry is that it can also help to mitigate climate change by increasing the plant biomass on the farm, so the amount of plant material that's there, and then therefore promote more carbon sequestration out of the atmosphere. So then thinking about, what can coffee farmers do? It might seem obvious, plant more trees, but in order to be most effective and to still maintain their coffee yields, agroforestry design can also be informed by research. And so that's what my lab does. I'm part of the Agrobiodiversity and Biogeochemistry lab at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. And what we do largely is we conduct research with farmers and international organizations to optimize this agroforestry design. And the research from my PhD has focused strictly on coffee production, coffee agroforestry. And some of my research looked at how different shade trees in shaded agroforestry with specific characteristics can modify the climate under their canopy in very distinct ways. And so all of this research, the goal is really to help inform farmers to design more effective agroforestry farms. And then what can coffee drinkers do? We know, again, the problem of climate change is massive. So one very small thing that we can do is supporting coffee agroforestry farms or agroforestry farms in general. But you're not the one picking the beans from the coffee farms. How do I know that it's an agroforestry farm? Well, what you can do is our main way right now is looking for certification labels. So I have two on the screen here, the Rainforest Alliance with the green frog, and then the bird friendly certification by the Smithsonian. And generally, these two certifications indicate that the product, whatever the product you're buying, was grown under some form of agroforestry. And now these certification systems or schemes, they're not perfect. So I do encourage you to still read up on what these certifications actually mean, because they do mean different things. So for example, the bird-friendly farms with the bird-friendly certification, they also need to be certified organic, and they need to contain a high amount of biodiversity. Whereas in the Rainforest Alliance certification scheme, they don't need to be organic, and they actually require a lower level of biodiversity if you were to compare the two certifications. And then to end on a positive note for us today, large corporations are beginning to also support these certification schemes. So some of these corporations, of course, they still have many negative aspects of their supply chain, including onto the environment. But it's still them adopting these certifications. It's still highlighting how there is a shift happening. So corporations are hearing that consumers do want more environmentally friendly products, and they're beginning to adopt some of these better practices. So there is a momentum for change that we are seeing. And then with that, I just wanted to say thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Stephanie, for that talk, that interesting talk on coffee. I drink coffee a lot, so it's really great to learn about, well, first of all, I guess what it looks like, because I don't know what I thought it looked like, but I didn't think it was a small bush. So yeah, that's super interesting, and learning, about more sustainable ways to grow coffee and how to look for that. So yeah, thank you. Yeah, so on to some questions. You had mentioned a bit closer to the beginning of your talk that one of the things they can do when a coffee plant, well, also I guess if they're 100 years old, but when it was closer to 20 years, that they will replant it in order for it to grow more beans. Why does this replanting help promote their bean growth?
Yeah, it's just because I guess coffee farmers have noticed that over time, the coffee plants start to produce fewer beans over time. What's actually really cool about coffee is the plant itself normally gets replanted every 20 years, but they actually cut it down to about 15 centimeters. So it's just this little stump sticking out of the ground that's waiting to trip you as you're walking through the farm. And then it actually regrows from there. And they do that every 5 to 7 years. And then that also promotes greater yield. Yeah, so there's multiple management aspects that they do just to encourage more bean production.
Oh yeah, that's really cool. I guess a follow-up question to that is, approximately how long does it take the plants then to go from these little, you said I think it was 15 centimeter stumps back up to the average size of a coffee plant that they would be actually harvesting from?
Yeah, so the average coffee plant size is about 2 meters tall. The ones that are managed like this. It takes, I believe it takes 3 to 4 years for the coffee plant to start producing beans again, those coffee beans. So there is a little bit of a transition time there, which is why when you see that, whole fields are affected by coffee leaf rust and they're all cut down or they all need to be replanted, that's a lot of time for a whole farm to have to regenerate to start producing an income, really.
Yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, so you were talking about how leaf rust kills the plant. What exactly is happening there? Is it just that it's damaging the leaves and the plant can't thrive? Like what's actually killing it?
Yeah, so it's a fungus that actually eats the leaf. It's a biotrophic fungus, so it eats the leaf. And then it obviously ends up killing the leaf. And then when the leaf dies, they fall from the plant, and a plant can't survive if there's no leaves on the plant anymore. So that can lead to branch death or plant death. But a lot of coffee farmers, if the coffee leaf rust is very bad, they'll do that pruning down to 15 centimeters just to try and keep that plant alive. But again, it still does need to go through that regrowth period.
Okay. Another question on this coffee leaf rust is, you mentioned that that you can get like an increased range of the disease. Is that like variants and such of the disease? Or what is the range of the coffee leaf rust?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, because I'm sure we know all about different strains of bad microorganisms going around. And this fungus is the same, so or diseases like this are the same. From what I understand, they think that the range might increase strictly just about the climatic changes that are going to be happening. So similar to plants that need certain conditions to grow and thrive, same with diseases. So this disease has an optimal temperature range, just like coffee plants do. So as those ranges change, the dynamics of where this disease is going to be will also change. It's probably a lot more complicated than the way I presented it, of course, because there's so many other factors that are coming in, and there's also a lot that we don't know. So generally speaking, that would be why the range would move around.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Thank you. So for these like trees that you're talking about for the agroforestry, is there like a certain like types of trees that are the most common that they're using, or is it just like a huge variety as long as they're tall enough to shade the plants?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. In the region where I've been collecting my data, there's a type of tree that it doesn't grow in North America. They call the tree poro, which I don't know why, that's in Spanish. And it's a leguminous tree. So it actually fixes nitrogen and adds that nitrogen to the soil. And it's a very common tree that they use in coffee agroforestry in the central region of Costa Rica, where I was studying, because of its ability to fix atmospheric nitrogen. So it's adding nitrogen to the soil essentially for free. So they don't need to apply as many fertilizers. But they're also quite easy to manage. So if you look at the tree on the screen right now, that's also a leguminous tree, but its canopy is really high. So it's quite hard for farmers to access the canopy to, let's prune it down because it's creating too much shade or something like that. Whereas the poro tree, that's very common. It's the scientific name, or the Latin name is Erythrina papagena. It's a lot shorter, so you can actually manage it to be a lot shorter and much easier just to chop down when you want it and stuff like that.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. That's really cool that the tree is helping in like so many ways. Like, yeah, you said like you can use less fertilizer, which really sounds like a win-win.
Yeah, there's many other reasons why agroforestry is a really cool option for smallholder farmers, beyond the way that it can help to mitigate these climate change effects, including that those nutrient dynamics, adding nutrients to the soil, more than just from nitrogen fixation, and then also improving soil moisture and all these other aspects as well. Also in terms of socioeconomic reasons as well.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And we'll wrap up on this question. It's, have you seen any species present in agroforestry systems that aren't on traditional coffee farms? I'm guessing that they're asking about species of coffee. 1 second, just to see which species they're referring to. I will hopefully get word in a moment. Okay. I've not been updated on which they mean. Oh, any types of species, like animals or plants.
In coffee agroforestry systems?
Versus traditional coffee farms. And birds is another thing that they specify.
Yes. So actually coffee is traditionally grown in agroforestry systems. It's a more recent change that a lot of farmers are doing to switch to full sun monoculture, but that's another conversation. Agroforestry is also known to promote the biodiversity of many other species, including birds and other insects. So I didn't do these biodiversity studies, but I noticed lots of, cool dragonflies flying around. I do know that bee populations and coffee plants depend on bees for pollination. They're impacted by the greater biodiversity. But there was also a cool toucan study going on one year that I was down there, where they were looking at how toucan populations are affected by agroforestry systems. So that's a pretty cool bird to see fly by your head when you're when you're down in Costa Rica for the first time.
That sounds like a personal experience. Did you get to see a toucan fly by your head?
I did, yes. And I later got to see a toucan get banded for further research. It was very, very cool.
Wow, yeah, that sounds really, really cool. Yeah, really interesting.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your talk, and thank you to all of our speakers for the 3 great talks on, like, the general climate change topic, but on different subsets. It was really interesting to be able to hear about, things that you eat all the time, like mustard and coffee, and also like how people study the actual atmosphere, which we need to live. And as as an astronomy and astrophysics group, it's really awesome to hear from the scientists that are actually doing this work. So thank you all very much. Great. Okay, and I'd also like to say a thank you to our volunteers in organizing this event and running our demo and activities, which will be happening next. Without them, again, this event wouldn't have been able to happen. And a thank you to our sponsors, because they are also required to make these events happen. So now I would again remind you to please fill out our feedback form at bit.ly/AstroTours, and that's where you can sign up for the raffle. And ignore the demo link that's on the screen. During the talk, something happened to it, so they're circulating a new Zoom link for the demos. You'll be able to see it on our Facebook page and in the YouTube chat, so please use that link, and you'll be able to go into different Zoom rooms on the greenhouse effect, comparing Earth and Venus's atmosphere, which, if you haven't heard before, Venus had a runaway greenhouse effect. So it's probably a pretty cool thing to look at, how to compare that to Earth. And also an Ask an Atmospheric Scientist room. So thank you all very much for joining. Hope to see you in our demos and in May for our next AstroTours.